Happy Yom Kippur afternoon. And we're saying hi to our friends who are joining us on Zoom. It's nice to have you with us. Let me explain a little bit how we're going to try to balance the Zoom participation with the room participation. Kathy very helpfully arranged all of this for us, so Yishar Kochech and Toda Rabbi. And reminded me of one essential thing, which is our friends at home on Zoom won't be able to hear the conversation in the room. So if you just came in late, we've already nixed the idea of passing around the microphone because of germs. So when we do have comments, we're going to ask you to speak briefly so I can recapitulate them for our friends who are listening in. And for our friends who are joining us on Zoom, the flip side of this is Sid Nestel kindly accepted the invitation from Kathy at my suggestion, so you can blame me, Sid, to field questions from our friends at home. We don't have a screen here, so we can't put you up and have you ask your question, but if you type it into the chat, they'll go to Sid, and every so often I will pause and ask Sid to share either a specific question or if we've got a cluster of comments that are sort of in the same area, they'll come through. And it's the same thing for our friends here in the room. I'd like to teach a little bit about this, but it's really set up this year to be conversational, okay? So before we look at this, just so our friends at home may not have seen this conversation earlier, but since Shirley Segev referenced it, back in the old days of Mordecai Kaplan's time, he decided that instead of the Anima Amin, the 13 I believes of Maimonides, on which the song Yigdal is based, that in the modern period, Judaism should, as it says here, the criteria of loyalty to Judaism can no longer be acceptance of a creed, but the experience of the need to have one's life enriched by Jewish heritage. So he then went on to write the 13 wants. We want Judaism, for example, to help us overcome temptation, doubt, and discouragement. And my favorite one, we want the Jew to be so trusted so that his yea is taken as a yea and his nay is taken as a nay. I always like that one. The only time that I recall this was ever read at Darchei Noam was the first year I led high holiday services, and I miscalculated the time of the service and sundown. And we were stalling. Yeah, Jen remembers, right? I mean, if it was in the back of the book, we read it, right? Yes. This must have gone on for about 40 minutes, right? So, yeah, that's about the only time that that's really gotten a lot of...
To the Hebrew school at Darchei Noam, and I printed it
Yeah.
and I taught the kids.
Yeah, well, there you go. It's the second time it's been used at Darchei Noam, so that's okay. That's okay. Anyway, so good Yantiv, Shana Tova. So what we're going to do in the time that I have, was Rabbi Ryan's teaching at 4:15. I want to honor his time. Let me tell you a little bit why I chose this topic. If you have the sheet in front of you, I assume that's being shared as a screen share on the Zoom, I hope. If someone's in charge of that, this would be the time to put it up on screen share. I hope that that's there. But we're going to be reading them anyway, so if your Zoom screen doesn't have it, don't worry, they're short text. So what I brought was 8 texts from Maimonides' code of Jewish law called Mishnah Torah, which means second Torah, repetition of Torah. It's the internal name by which Deuteronomy self-references itself in the 5 books of Moses, but Maimonides' Mishnah Torah really is meant as a condensation, recapitulation of the debates in Jewish law. And so what Maimonides tried to do in the medieval period was to cut through all of the conversation that you'd find in Mishnah or in Gemara, in the halakha conversations, and just tell the average Jew what you had to do. Right? It's sort of like the 3-volume set the Reconstructionist movement put out some years ago, which you may or may not have seen, called A Guide to Jewish Practice. if you basically want to cut to the chase, like here's the stuff. If you want to look at the debate, you can find the debate elsewhere. So in Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, he's got a section called Hilchot Teshuva, the laws of repentance or the laws of Teshuvah. So let me take one step back and tell you about something that I'm really interested in the last year or two and taught an adult ed class on it at a synagogue in Philadelphia last year. I got very interested in the metaphor of Judaism as a language. If Judaism was a language, I think it would have three primary dialects. And the three primary dialects would be Agadah, right? Legend and story. The second dialect would be Halacha, Jewish law. And the third dialect would be Tefillah, which is prayer and liturgy. Now, I know that Jewish tradition speaks in sub-dialects. So what's a sub-dialect of story? Would be the category, for example, of Hasidic tales, right? Subcategory of something like Halacha might be the contemporary Musar movement. But when Judaism speaks in these languages, it speaks differently. And one of the things that I've become interested in is, which of these dialects is like the right Jewish dialect for this time in Jewish history? Like, are we living in a time of prayer dialect as primary, or legal dialect as primary, or story dialect as primary? So in the adult ed class where I had, 3 sessions of 90 minutes to 2 hours each, we had a long conversation about this, looking at different kinds of ways Jews talk about the same thing from a different point of view. We actually looked at the Shema in legend, the Shema in law, and the Shema in prayer. And the consensus of the folks at Beth Israel Synagogue and Media outside of Philadelphia was that story is the right dialect for this moment in Jewish history. That we're not a community that's speaking so much the questions of law. What should we do? What can't we do? When do we do it? How do we do it? Who gets to do it? Why did we do it? And those sorts of questions. That said, I chose nonetheless to bring you some texts about repentance or teshuvah that come from Maimonides' legal perspective. So we're going to be looking in the hour that we have at some traditions about teshuvah, but they're being asked from the point of view of legal discourse. And so one of the things that I'm hoping will work for you and for our friends at home is that we'll have more of a conversation. Partly that's because, rabbis' voices by this time of the day are not in the best shape, but I don't have to do anything until Nila, so I can shuffle along. But also I'd like you to have a chance to hear from each other. So I'm going to read a text, and then underneath it, there's italics with a bunch of questions, and we'll pause and see what you want to say. So Sid, are you able to tell from the screen if it's up on the screen? It's not up, okay. There's a link in the chat, so the folks at home, if you click on that link, you should be able to get to it. But I'm going to read the text anyway. So in case you don't have it in front of you, that way it's covered. So the first text that I selected, parentheses, I apologize for not bringing the Hebrew. I know many of you read the Hebrew, and it's helpful to have the Hebrew. I was just trying to save a little bit of paper, but being lazy is not an excuse. So the first text is, Rambam Maimonides asks the question, what is teshuvah gemorah? What's complete repentance? How do you know when someone has achieved teshuvah, has done teshuvah? And then he answers, well, here's how you would know. One who finds oneself in a position to repeat a violation, but does not do so because of teshuvah, has done complete teshuvah. If they don't do so out of fear of being caught, that doesn't count. You haven't done full teshuvah. If the only reason you opted out the second time is you thought somebody was watching and you were going to get nailed, that doesn't count. Or lack of strength. Boy, 50 years ago, when I used to go on those conventions to the hotel and my wife couldn't come, boy, did we have a good time. But 50 years later, can't really do that anymore. So those kind of examples, what Maimonides is alluding to, those don't count as real teshuvah. Because what he's implying is that if you weren't worried about getting caught, for example, you would potentially commit the same transgression again. If you were physically or emotionally capable, presumably physically, of committing the same transgression, and you wish you could, but you're unable to, forgive me, rise to the occasion, then that doesn't count. So the questions that I asked here are, is there any requirement of attitude in Maimonides' position, of regret or remorse? Because here we're speaking the language of law. We're not speaking the language of intent. In other words, to put it more simply, if you'd really like to, and you don't particularly regret that you did last time, but you don't do it the second chance, it sounds like Maimonides is saying that's tshuva. So then I ask the question, well, what happens if you never have a second chance? Can you really then do teshuvah? Your firm cuts back its travel budget. You don't get sent to the conventions anymore. You don't get a free pass to the hotel. So, you don't have the opportunity to see if temptation would lead you astray again. So that's the first question I wanted to bring to you. From Maimonides' perspective, if teshuvah gemorah, complete repentance, is finding yourself in the same place where you transgressed previously, but you don't because you've had a change of heart, is that adequate? And how much of teshuvah is about internal emotional experience of regret or remorse or shame or guilt? And how much of teshuvah is simply about behavior? So before we look at citation number 2, maybe you want to respond to citation number 1. Anything there provoke your interest either in what's on the sheet, what I read for our folks at home, or something that it triggered off in your imagination? Okay.
You have no control if it's not going to happen again. If they cut back the travel budget, whether you did the internal work or whether you would fail if they didn't cut back, you have no control of that. So you only have control over your inner change. You actually may not know if you've done the work. You don't get the same.
Right, okay, so again, for our friends at home, I'm just consolidating and recapitulating so they can hear the comment. And this is a specific objection that you've anticipated that people raised against Maimonides' position. If the definition of this is the next time around you don't do it, and you never have a next time around, either they cut the travel budget or whatever, you'll never know if you've done teshuvah because you never had the opportunity to test yourself. So it's a really good observation, and it's one of the things that Maimonides had to deal with as a critique of his position. So good, thanks. Mitchell, you're up next. This is good, we may get to number 2.
This is antithetical to some of what I have always thought about Judaism, that it's a behavioral-based religion, not a faith-based religion. But halakha doesn't say you have to do the mitzvot. Doesn't say what your intention is. You have to do it.
Right.
You go to the
Right.
Hasidim, they believe, but they act. And here Rambam is saying the opposite, that intention and that what happens internally in your intent is more important than what your actual behavior might be. And that to me, maybe I'm exaggerating what he's saying, but he's certainly
Yeah.
saying, we keep
Yeah.
reading it, he's saying in each of these cases, the behavior, the speech, or the turning away from the action is less important than having a truly internal change.
So Mitchell's comment, it has to do with the balance of interior emotional, spiritual, intent, transformation, change, and the behavioral piece, and whether they have to be in alignment, and which of those is, in the common language today of the academy, being privileged, right? Which of those is more important? I don't know, Mitchell, other people may disagree. My read of Maimonides is he's less concerned about the interior and more concerned about the behavioral. He's only saying, my read of Maimonides is that the behavioral is determinative if it is matched to the right intention. If it's purely, as you said, circumstantial, that it doesn't happen, then you don't get any credit for that piece. So I think it's one of the problems that's been raised here. If we ever make it to the bottom of this sheet, and this is just on side 1, which we probably won't, but we will come around to the 10th of the 10 Commandments, which is the most puzzling one, because that's the one that says you shouldn't covet. And that's the only one of the 10 Commandments that's, as we say in Philadelphia, attitudinal, right? Because that's what we call it in Philadelphia, attitude. And there's a real big debate in Jewish law and tradition around that 10th commandment. It's those of you old enough to remember Jimmy Carter's Playboy interview, right, in 1976, where he said, I've committed adultery in my heart. And all of a sudden, all these Jews wanted to know from their rabbis, like, do we believe that? With varying degrees of anxiety, by the way, behind that question. It was the same kind of problem, Mitchell. It's a good anticipation of that question as well. Yeah. Somebody else was up. Yeah. Go ahead, Esther. You're next, and then Sylvia's after you.
I think there is a requirement of remorse or regret, because there literally may not be a second chance to go to another convention, but if you have a hard time controlling your impulses, or you have a certain kind of behavior or mental mindset that leads you to a kind of behavior, it doesn't have to be the identical one to replicate the sin, right? You can.
Right.
So really working on the inner part of it is really important, and because otherwise other circumstances may prompt.
Right. So Esther's comment, correct me if I miss anything here, the essence of it is working on the internal part in the end is determinative, because even if a similar circumstance presents itself, it may not be exactly analogous. So how close does it have to be? What do you say to Maimonides? Look, it was the Sheraton, not the Holiday Inn. Sylvia, you were up next.
So I'm going to try and put a parenting lens on this.
A parenting lens. Okay, good.
And say that when you are raising children, you don't want them to do the right thing because they fear that they'll be grounded or have their phone taken away. You want them to say to themselves, okay, this was bad, and it was explained to me by Iman Abba why this was bad. And I'm now in this, not the same, but kind of similar situation. Like, I shoplifted a pack of gum, and that was bad. So I'm similarly not going to steal my classmates' Doritos out of their lunch bag. Because they explained to me, and I internalized what the problem with that is.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of, like, they might not, in their heart of hearts regret eating those Doritos, but they have now had to reckon with the feeling that they gave the other person by taking something that they value.
Right.
And now
Right.
they know something. I feel like that's kind of what's going on here.
So let me recapitulate for the folks at home, so make sure that they've heard the general sense of the comment. The parenting metaphor, which is used a lot in tshuva discussions, is that maybe at a very early age, the motivation, like for kids, is like it's dangerous. At a certain stage, adolescence, it's if you do that, you'll be grounded or have your phone taken away or whatever it is. But as parents, I don't know if we thought this as kids, by the way, but from the point of view of parenting, the ideal situation is when children have internalized that and the parents aren't around, and they do it for that reason, not because they can get away with it. They choose not to do it. And, many of us have that experience with the first time, like, we didn't do something and we could have gotten away with it. And there's a kind of nice feeling about that when you have that opportunity. What I want to suggest is 2 more comments in the room, and then we'll see if there's anything from the Zoom. And I do want to get to at least 1 or 2 of the others that are here. So Sid, did you want to comment or are you conveying? Okay, Sid is going to be the shaliach from Zoom.
Okay, so Friedel asked, or said, a person may choose not to repeat a behavior because their intention has changed. For example, you use your computer on Shabbat and then stop because you want a more complete rest. You would have to tell your friends that you no longer are available on the computer on Shabbat. They need to know your intention has changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Friedel's comment is to the effect, make sure I've got this right, that a change in behavior has to be communicated to people who are used to seeing you behave in a different way, right? And there's actually one of these, I don't know if we'll get to this one because it's, I think, the last one, but, well, actually, if you'll bear with me, and since Friedel has brought it up, just flip the sheet over, which the folks at home, I'm sorry, I know you can't do that because for whatever reason, we're not screen sharing you. But I'll read the text for our friends at home. Maimonides says here, it's the custom of those who do teshuvah to be exceedingly humble. If fools insult them by reminding them of their former bad conduct, you used to use the computer on Shabbat, saying, but yesterday you did thus and such, and yesterday you said thus and such, have no bad feelings against them, for this very insult shows how far you have come. Because they really see the difference in your behavior. Like, this is like a good thing, right? But it is nevertheless a grievous sin to say to one who has done teshuvah, remember when you were not such a good person, and you did this, and you did this, and you did this? And it's not nice to remind them in their presence, or to put them to shame, or to mention things and subjects similar to them to remind them of what they did. We'll come back to this at the end, or we won't have time, but we'll see. But the question I asked there is, why is it a sin to remind people of something bad they once did after they have apologized for it and done teshuvah? So just hold that question for a minute, because I want to give Friedel the benefit of the doubt here, because if I understood Friedel, I'm looking at the camera as if I'm looking at you, so trust me, I assume you're there. I know that you didn't imply that using the computer makes you a bad Jew and a bad person. So I don't mean to run those things together. I think you were signaling that change in a behavior that is either out of an internal reason for wanting to behave differently or an external reason is something that has to be conveyed. And in the conveying of that, you often model and teach something. Okay, we had one more, someone else. Oh, yes, you had signal. Mm-hmm.
To be stiff-necked, we're not supposed to be stubborn, we're not supposed to do all of those things. But that's where the challenge is. Because generally, it's not like, well, I won't be stiff-necked because I won't get caught. Or
Right.
I won't be sarcastic or those kinds of things. So that's where I think, tying the notion of repentance to the sins that we're confessing on Yom Kippur and saying, if we try not to do those things, that's probably the way to go.
Yeah, this is so the comment is to the question of what Maimonides and earlier Talmudic tradition calls teshuvah gemara. So it's different from teshuvah. Teshuvah gemara is like complete repentance, right? Like no going back. Like, you're in a good place. Teshuvah gemara is one of those things that's elusive in Jewish tradition. Regular old teshuvah, which is my preferred version of it, is kind of slippery. You have to keep coming back to it. Because despite our best intentions in the Ashamnu or the Achet confessions on Yom Kippur, parking lot discussions about the rabbi's sermon after Nila, just to pick something that I've occasionally overheard. Something's like, do you remember what we said like 8 hours ago in the morning service about sins of speech, right? Like, at least wait till you get home and break the fast before you tell me how crummy the sermon was. Yeah, so teshuva, like, to me, and, Rabbi Ryan very kindly offered me this, opportunity to speak last Shabbat that Rabbi Tina's honoring, and, when I then backed out on his offer to do the Devar Torah because of time, and he stepped in, thank you, right? I had only gotten as far as wanting to say, why does Shabbat Shuvah come in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Because you gave the appropriate example, that, in the old days there were only two sermons, right? One was before Pesach and one was between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which actually begs the question of why isn't it before Rosh Hashanah? Why isn't Shabbat Shuvah the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah? You need to think about this stuff from the rabbi before, because on Pesach it does you no good to be told the laws of the kashrut of Passover in the middle of the holiday, right? Like, oh, Cheerios? Nobody told us, right? So it's too late at that point. And what I would have said if I had finished the Devar Torah for last Saturday, which I didn't, but kindly Rabbi Ryan picked up the slack there, was that tshuva is an ongoing process in the majority of Jewish thought. So to this question of teshuva gemorah, complete teshuva, versus the impulse, the movement towards, like I said in the sermon this morning, for those of you who are upstairs, the compass, right, instead of the map. If you think of teshuva as a compass, it kind of keeps pointing you in the right direction. So when you think to check the compass, say, oh, I thought I was going north. And so you make the adjustment. And that's a good lead in to number 2. See what I did there? That was good. Right. Thank you. So citation number 2, notice here Maimonides says, what's repentance? He doesn't say what's complete repentance. So he says, number 1, the sinner shall cease sinning. So Mitchell, this is your point. Baseline criteria number 1 is don't do that. Right? So once you stop doing that, you're on the path of tshuva. Okay? Second step is remove the sin from your thoughts. And what we're not sure of here, although there's lots of commentary, is the general idea of it or the specific act that you already did. Right? Like I'm thinking that it might be a good idea when nobody's looking, as Sylvia suggested, I can pocket this gum, right? Or the Doritos. Although Doritos are going to be a dead giveaway to the next person you talk to, right? So it's not a good idea. Okay? And the third is wholeheartedly conclude not to revert back to it. And then he says it's moreover essential that his confession shall be by spoken words of his lips. This is what I wanted to get you to. And all that which he concluded in his heart must be formed in speech. This is actually really interesting. So the question is, are all 3 necessary? In other words, does 1 count, does 2 count, does 3 count, or is this a package deal? So that's the first question. And the second question is, why or why not? And then what's an action? And the really curious question to me, because it's going to come up in the next 2 teachings, why does it have to be said out loud? And that's both a technical question for anyone who knows the Haftorah from Shabbat Shuvah. Just gave you a big hint there. But don't worry if you don't pick it up, because I'll tell you what it is. And a more general question. What is this thing about having to say it out loud? So let me ask you the first question. Are all 3 necessary? As Mitchell suggested, if you just stop doing it, isn't that enough? Removing the sin from your thoughts, who has control over that? Do you remember something really bad you did when you were 10 years old? I mean, I can't be the only one in the room who could say yes to that, right? Maybe not 10, okay, 9, 11. I'm sorry, bad choice of dates. But you get the idea, right? Is there anyone here who isn't still embarrassed, ashamed of something that you did way back when? The people who held you accountable for it may have all passed on by now. And the other people, that you go to apologize for don't know what you're talking about because they don't remember it either, right? But you remember it, don't you? Right? I mean, everyone's got those things. So for Rambam to say, remove sin from your thoughts, if he's talking about a specific thing that you did, good luck in controlling your thoughts, okay? And then concluding not to revert back to it. So what do you think about number 2? Are all of them necessary? Why or why not? What's an actual act here? And I'm mostly interested in, why do you think he says it has to be out loud? Why do you have to say it? David?
Is that third
It's a good question. David's asking whether the practice requirement of silent prayer is that you have to mumble just audibly enough to get from your mouth to your ear, right? So when we say we continue silently, we actually don't. Of course, if we said we continue by mumbling, that would sound a little less elegant, right? So we say davening, which actually means mumbling. It's a long way, David, of saying, I don't think so. But it's a good point, though. It's a good point. Kathy?
So in the first one of the things that I found missing was any attempt to right the wrong, any attempt to
Good.
restore the relationship
Good.
that suffered from the
Mhm.
sin, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm just wondering if this is an attempt to do exactly that, to communicate, to basically to say you're sorry to the people that you have harmed.
Right, and so Kathy's question is about, I think what in contemporary parlance is often called restorative justice, or at least the restorative justice conversation kind of overlaps with this conversation, right? So Kathy, say the last part of what you said again? Or the first part, just remind me, because I was thinking of something.
Saying that in the first paragraph, the part that I found missing was any attempt.
Oh, okay, thank you, right. So Kathy's saying in the first citation, what's complete repentance? That you won't do it again. Even if you could, you won't. If it's a transgression against someone for which there could be restitution, let's assume that that's financial, right? Like you embezzled money, right? And you do tshuva and say, I did something wrong, I apologize for doing it wrong, I'll never do it again, and you don't pay it back, right? Is that teshuva? Do you have to do the restitution? And that's, again, just to go back to the dialect metaphor, why I think the halachic dialect shouldn't get left behind in this modern moment of Judaism, because that's where those kind of questions get answered. The story dialect is lovely, the prayer dialect is always interesting, but the law dialect is really crucial, because that's where stuff actually gets decided. So there's a whole set of laws in Jewish tradition about economic and other kinds of restitution, just like it would be in civil courts. My guess is we're sitting in a room with a bunch of Jews, and maybe some folks that's not your tradition, but I'm going to guess there's at least somebody here who's connected to the legal profession, just as a general Jewish demographic. So, so we have that in civil law also, right? I'm sure you have it in Canadian law. I don't know much about that. We certainly have it in U.S. law, that it's not only you have to be guilty of something, you also have to make reparation for it. And that's part of the reparations discussion as well. Sid?
Yeah, so, the third one is definitely necessary, because if you just stop sinning, okay, I'm in the middle of doing something bad, and I say, oops, that's bad, and I stop doing it, but then I do it again tomorrow, well, that's sort of not very much of tshuva. Yeah, I stopped
Right.
myself one time, but then I
Right.
do it again, I just do it again
Right.
tomorrow. The second one seems to be impossible given the third one. It's like, don't think of an elephant. Wholeheartedly, you're not going to repay. I'm not going to steal again, but forget about stealing.
Right.
It's
Right.
like almost contradictory, so I don't really understand what he's getting at. I think he's trying to say put temptation out of your way, but the thought of wanting to do it, that's not what he said. But maybe that's what he meant.
Yeah.
And as far as the speech, I think that's very important. When you have thoughts, at least I, and I think I'm projecting, they're not well formed, but they're like feelings. You feel bad, you feel regretful, yeah, I should, but you have to put it into words, like either by saying it out loud, you have to formulate specifically what it is you did wrong, what it is you
Yeah.
want to do again. You have to,
Yeah.
and even if it's not meant for, I think Kathy assumed you're saying it to the person who was harmed, but even if you're not, just having to say it for yourself, it's like writing in a diary, you're admitting it, you're making it hard and firm, and you're putting it into, you don't leave it in that sort of vague, gee, I don't feel good.
Right, right. Yeah, so for the folks at home who might not have been able to hear that entire comment, I think the core issue, Sid, that you put on the table is how to concretize apology and how to concretize, a sense, an act of teshuvah, right? So Sylvia, to use your model again of parenting, when, a parent says, tell your brother you're sorry, right? and the kid says, sorry, right? Now can I have my phone back, right? So there's, even the articulation of it, right, can be like that. But in more complex adult relationships, where people have said or done things, especially said things, and someone says, like, I'm really sorry that I hurt your feelings. And the other person said, actually, you didn't hurt my feelings. So now, this is a really good opening to do more in-depth tshuva. Because once you name it, oh, I hurt your feelings, I'm sorry. And the other person says, that's not what I'm upset about. They say, well, what are you upset? And then in the give and take, you have to name it from the point of view of the person against whom you transgressed. So you might think that you've covered it, but you haven't. So let me just mention to you the Shabbat Shuvah reference for this. You may remember that the Haftarah for Shabbat Shuvah is a bit messy because it comes depending upon whether you're Ashkenazic, Sephardic, or whatever community you came from in Europe. All the traditions are different. But usually there's 3 different prophets from whom you read. I think it's the only time during the year when that happens. But the first one, Hosea, is famous for saying, the verse in English is, return Israel to the Lord your God, say to God, forgive all guilt and accept what is good. And here comes the key line. Instead of bulls, sacrifices, we will pay the offerings of our lips. And I think that that's what Maimonides and earlier traditions of having to articulate it verbally are hanging that tradition on. That the substitute for bringing sacrifices, which is how our ancestors unloaded guilt 3,000 years ago. And there's hardly anything in the Torah, by the way. You read Leviticus. You bring the sacrifice, the priest takes the sacrifice, the priest offers the sacrifice, you're off the hook, you go home. Nothing in there about intent, nothing in there about reparations, because that's expiation delegated to an agent, right? That's the Levitical system. The Jewish system, which doesn't have much in common with that, is you can't delegate tshuva. You can't send someone else to do tshuva. You can send someone else to say, somebody, would like to know if they call you to apologize, will you accept the call, right? Have you unblocked them on your phone? But they can't do it for you. Is there something else there, Sid?
Yeah, so, 2 comments. Gloria says, it takes courage to say it out loud and moral courage to avoid the sin with social pressure. And someone whose name is clearly said, saying it out loud is a marker. Once it is out loud, all ambiguity is removed.
Yeah, saying it out loud definitely is a marker, and the ambiguity, I would say probably is greatly reduced, right? My experience of relationships with other people, especially bumpy ones, is we never quite resolve all the ambiguity, but we resolve enough of it. Maya, go ahead.
Is point number 3 intended as a rehearsal or conveying a verbal apology to the person you wronged?
To wholeheartedly conclude not to revert back to it, that's the rehearsal?
No, saying it out loud, saying your apology, verbalizing your apology to yourself from your lips.
Oh, okay,
Intended as,
yeah.
Here's preparation for doing it in real time, real life, this person you have wronged.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Should you rehearse your conversation of teshuvah before you venture out to approach somebody? That's I never thought of that. That's good, Maya. It's a really interesting question.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea, right? The more complicated the circumstance, probably the better it is to have some idea of what you're going to say, rather than just say, are you free for coffee at 3? Right? Yeah, Sylvia, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I do. I think Meyer has a really good point, and I also, what I was originally doing that. Yeah, I'm drawing from real life, just like with the Doritos. You know, I have an unbroken streak of many months now of actually taking my vitamins that I never had before. So does my friend, because we said we've been neglecting this.
Uh-huh,
We're
uh-huh,
gonna hold each other accountable for it.
uh-huh.
And it works. So like, that's a minor thing, but.
No, it's okay. The idea, and this is very much part of the Musar movement, for those of you who are interested in that or maybe, participate in that. In the contemporary forms of the Musar movement, which is the movement devoted to cultivating ethical attributes and characteristics primarily, you usually work with a partner, somebody that you trust, but it's sort of like, I did this, I'm working on this, right? Yeah, it's in other religious traditions as well. Catholic tradition calls it spiritual direction, for example. Catholic tradition also has confession, which we may get to on the second side of the sheet if we get there. Not the Catholic tradition. Maimonides wasn't big in the Catholic tradition, but they're talking about the same issues, though. Okay? So let me just take a look at where we are. We're a little bit before 3:45, so we have about 20 minutes, a little bit more than that. So let me read a little bit more from the text here, if that's okay, and then we'll move on and take some more conversation. Number 3 is a bit of a summary of what you've already been sharing here this afternoon. Maimonides says, one who confesses by speech, but has no intention to abandon his bad conduct, tell your brother you're sorry, is like one taking an immersion in a mikveh and at the same time holding in his hand an impure reptile, when he knows the immersion will be of no value until he casts away the impure reptile. It's a great phrase if you can memorize it, from Jewish tradition, called sheretz biyado. Because reptiles are like unkosher things, right? So it's like saying I'm going into the mikvah holding a cheeseburger, right? Would be our version of that, right? This is transgressive, this is purification, and they cancel each other out, right? So what Maimonides is saying here, I think, Mitchell, this goes to the point you raised earlier, is how do you bring these things into alignment? You can pay what the court tells you to pay for the money you embezzled. You can admit that you were guilty, but if your intent hasn't changed, then you may be legally off the hook. But in terms of your personality and character development, you're still out of sync. Yeah. So the question that I put here is, how do we know an apology is sincere? I'm actually going to leave as a rhetorical question for a moment. But if you happen to have been in my service on the second day of Rosh Hashanah when I did the 10 things about teshuvah from movie lines, I'm digressing. Remember when Harry met Sally? And everybody thought, you all thought what line I was going to say, right? I'll have what she's having. Which was in the original sermon. And to my wife, thank you, dear, told me it didn't belong there. And she was right. But the point I was going to make is, remember the setup for I'll have what she's having, right? Is faking an orgasm. The question was, can you fake an apology? Which I still think is an interesting question. Wouldn't have been great in the sermon. It's an interesting question. How do you know when an apology is sincere? And that goes to the question of the other person's experience as well as your own internal experience. And that's a really puzzling one in Jewish law. Because here, again, allow me to digress into something more consequential than when Harry met Sally. This is the difference in the dialects. The dialect of Jewish law largely focuses on absolving the person who's committed the transgression of the transgression. How do you get clean when you've done something wrong? The story narrative of Jewish tradition, the story dialect, is more conversational. And in that kind of Jewish dialect, it's not just about, okay, I did it wrong, I apologized, I made restitution. If you're using the dialect of story, the other person's experience of your apology is going to have a lot to do with whether teshuvah has taken place or not. The legal dialect is not going to be so much about the other person. Is that clear? It's not? Okay. It's a complicated point, and there's much more to it than I just summarized. But in general, when you're talking about the law of tshuva, the halacha of tshuva, it's not exclusively, but primarily focusing on the person who committed the transgression. Shirley?
So I thought there's something called mitoch shelo l'shem yavo l'shem,
So you want to translate for the folks who don't know what that is?
which means that even if you do something without intent and complete conviction, it may bring you, if you repeat it, to do it with conviction, which encourages us to do things even when we're not yet capable to do them fully.
Yeah.
What about
Yeah. So the idea that imperfect tshuva is better than no tshuva, right? That's like the short version of what you're saying. And the more you practice, the better you might get. So that eventually you could become what's called a Baal tshuva, but not a Baal tshuva. You become a Baal tshuva, it means you're someone who's mastered, by and large, most of the time, the ability to do tshuva when you're called on to do that. But you know, the linguistic term Baal tshuva is, someone who wasn't raised observant and becomes from, like Jewishly observant ritually. So that's a different term, okay? Yeah, good point. Sid, anything else happen in there that we need to attend to? Okay, yeah.
In terms of knowing an apology sincere, I think it goes back to the first point that talked about in terms of finding yourself in a position to repeat the violation on both sides. Like, when you make an apology, you don't know how sincere it's going to be until you're in a parallel type of situation. And how you act, you may think that you're being very sincere.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking Hal makes a good point, which is, until you're engaged in the dynamic of tshuva and see how the back and forth goes, you actually don't know what's being accomplished, in that moment. You may think that, you've done the right thing or you rehearsed the right words, but it doesn't mean that the other person hears it that way. Which is also, a good lead into what's going to be on the second side of the sheet after we get the next comment.
So in terms of a sincere apology to me means that you have to have no conditions attached to your apology. It has to be clear that you feel that you're wrong, and that you recognize that what you've done is wrong, and there can't be any but or any of that. To me, that's a symbol or a signal of a true apology, as opposed to somebody who puts a bit of a condition on it.
Mhm. So the question that's being put, into the conversation here is, a true apology is unconditional?
Yeah.
If you don't mind my asking a question back, where would you put explanation in that example that you just gave?
I don't know what I would. I think if I'm gonna really and truly feel badly about doing something and want to apologize to somebody for it, I might not, unless I made a mistake and it wasn't an intentional thing that I had done, I had made a mistake, then I might actually add an explanation to it. But if I did something wrong and I knew it was wrong, I don't think I would try to put an explanation in there. I'd say,
Yeah.
there's no way I can explain this the way you do.
So it's asking the question about explanation, for two reasons. One is you've now added to the conversation a very significant piece of the dialect of Jewish law about tshuva, which is whether it's deliberate or what's called in Hebrew bishgaga, accidental, right? Like I hadn't slept for 3 days, I had taken, too much medication, and then I forgot and I had 2 drinks at dinner, and that's why when you said what you said at the party, I embarrassed you by yelling at you in front of everybody. But I have a prior relationship and a after relationship, and that's an exception. And the other person says, yeah, I know, that's really not like you. Like, what was going on that night, right? That's what I meant by explanation. And I think you raise a good point that that's usually more relevant when it's accidental, unintentional, It's not your normal pattern of behavior. When it's something for which you had intent, opportunity to avoid, and you not only did it, but you did it really well, and you really like doing it, what's gonna make that okay, right? It's like politicians, were fond of saying, I was quoted out of context. When I used to work for the Jewish Community Relations Council in Philadelphia many, many years ago, we had a politician on the city council who said something that was just so outrageous. And when he was nailed on it, he said, well, I was quoted out of context. And the executive director of our agency said, with due respect, councilman, it's hard to imagine a context in which that comment could have ever been acceptable. Right? So, yeah, there you go. Okay, let's go to the second side of the sheet, because I'm skipping around a bit here, keeping track of the time and trying to follow the line of comments that you folks are kind enough to share. So again, for our friends at home who don't have this, I want to read this out loud clearly. What if one did not offend another person except in words? That's a big except. Then one is, in the age of social media especially, right? Then one is obliged to approach her and implore her till one be forgiven by her. By the way, Rambam didn't use female pronouns. It was just getting to be a lot of men here, so I switched it up a little bit. So what if the neighbor refuses to forgive? Then a group of 3 friends should come to her and beg her to forgive. If she still refuses, one should bring a second and even a third group, 3 more friends. That's 9 right by now. What if she still refuses to forgive? Then, again, remember, this is the dialect of law. Then the sin now rests upon her, the one who refused to forgive. And this, by the way, you'll find elsewhere in Maimonides, that if you go to someone and you apologize 3 times for something that you did, and they say, I don't forgive you, I don't forgive you, I don't forgive you, in the dialect of Jewish law, you're now off the hook. You've done tshuva. They haven't forgiven you, it's now on them. I don't know how that lands for you, by the way, but in the dialect of halakha in Jewish tradition, that's how the agency and control issue, to use contemporary lingo, gets addressed. To put it differently, if teshuva was contingent on the other person saying, I forgive you, they might never forgive you. That's a lot of power to give to somebody, right? So Jewish law, wants to figure out how can teshuva do the same thing that sacrifices used to do. So remember, we're on a line here from sacrifice to repentance. And what sacrifices let you do was bring the sacrifice, you give it to the Kohen, and you're off the hook. You got a clean slate. It's like the end of Nila tonight, right? You walk out of here when it's dark, the slate is like wiped clean if you're willing to accept the gift, right? So the question I asked here is, what happens when someone apologizes and the other person won't forgive? How does the person who did the wrong then get forgiveness? Is it reasonable to demand that someone must forgive another? This comes up a lot in Christian-Jewish dialogue. The turn the other cheek thing that happens in the New Testament, and has come up a number of times. I can't remember, we have so many mass shootings in the United States, I can't cite them anymore by time and place, but the one that took place several years ago in a church during a Bible study group, one of the things that our media chose to elevate around that was how many members of the families of people who were killed there forgave the attacker, leading to a whole discussion, in the media about what are religious perspectives on that. Anyway, what might you want to share about number 5 here? Someone who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. Michael, yes.
So back to your comment about context. What if the person who's receiving the apology said, but this is the 10th time you apologize? I just don't believe it. And by the way, if you're really serious, you take that $30,000. So we also have a Jewish tradition of mediation, right? Like you could say, and when on the 3rd time the party will go
Mm-hmm.
this whole issue of fake apology. So it seems to me that the automatic forgiveness of the person doesn't account for the fake apology, lack of restitution, complexity.
Hmm. Yeah, this is an interesting question that Michael has raised, which is the sense of automatic forgiveness, right, can become either routine or controlling or insincere and doesn't really tell you, like what the dynamic is. It does, by the way, sometimes give you a chance to weigh things, because what feels like a burden to the transgressor may not have landed as heavily on the person against whom we think we've transgressed. It's been bothering me all year that I said thus and such to you at the October synagogue board meeting. And now it's the June board meeting. We're not going to meet in July and August, so I really want to apologize. The person says, it wasn't a big deal then, it's not a big deal now. So it could go in that direction as well. Yes, please.
Are there some sins that are unforgivable?
Yeah, I figured someone was going to ask this question, so thank you. Are there some sins that are unforgivable? If you've hung around with me enough years, you know what I like to do when I don't know the answer to a question is I like to reframe the question. So what I'd like to reframe the question to is, who owns that answer to the question of, are there some sins that are unforgivable? I doubt that there are too many Jews who are active with our Jewish identity who have not come across once in your lifetime someone who's not Jewish asking why all these years after the Holocaust, Jews can't just forgive and forget. And if it hasn't happened to you directly, trust me, it's happened to someone that you know, right? So the question, this was, Elie Wiesel was asked this question once, right? And as I recall, and he said, this is not my forgiveness to give. The people for whom that forgiveness, would be theirs to give, aren't here to offer it. So I don't know what the issue is with things for which there can be no forgiveness, but it does lead us into number 6, which I'm just moving to because of time, but I'm using that as a jumping off point.
I'm sorry, can I just have clarification? The part except in words, so is it different if such a process, if it's about action?
Hal's asking the question about the first phrase, the first sentence in number 5. What if one did not offend another person except in words? Does that become the determinative category? To the best that I recall, it's been a while since I studied this whole section, a really long time since I studied the whole section. I think how this is an example of the 3 times and you're off the hook rule that Maimonides generally follows around almost any example that he brings. Right? 3 times you apologize, after the 3rd time, it's on the other person. I think I just happened to bring one that was about words. But let me take it to number 6 because it's related. Number 6 says, it's forbidden to be ill-natured and unforgiving. That's a big forbidden, right? One must be easily appeased and not easily angered. When a sinner implores for forgiveness, one should grant forgiveness wholeheartedly and soulfully. Even if one persecuted another and sinned against that person exceedingly, this may be the question of, are there some sins for which there's no forgiveness? One should not be vengeful and grudge-bearing. And I ask the question, who's the rule meant for, the sinner or the one sinned against? So I think this is a really interesting problem. David, go ahead.
I think it's partly this question, but I want to go back to 2 examples that you talked about related. One was, I think you were talking about churches that have been bombed, and the other is the Holocaust. Why can't you just forgive? I'm not sure it should be on the person who's been transgressed against to decide that the other person needs to be forgiven if the other person has not asked for forgiveness. If somebody bombs a church and they all say, oh, we forgive the person, where is the value in that if it doesn't change the people who are doing the transgressions? In the Nazis have never asked for forgiveness or apologized.
Right, right.
And that's the answer to why can't you forgive? Because they've never apologized nor asked for forgiveness.
Yeah, the interesting question of, in Jewish law, of whether the person transgressed against can initiate the apology by saying, I know you didn't apologize, but I forgive you. Now, aside from the fact that that might be a really good way to drive certain kinds of people totally crazy, right? Because now you've taken the power out of their hands of oppressing you, so that's kind of a fun project, right? But it's an interesting question, David, that you're raising. If there isn't an apology, why should there be forgiveness? So what's the prompt? So in the dance of teshuvah, right, like, you're trying to like match the steps here, what comes first? So in most of the dialect of Judaism that speaks law, it's on the person who committed the transgression to initiate the reconciliation. The question I wanted to ask about this, and we're going to stop here because I don't want to run over into Rabbi Ryan's time, is what's the imperative in number 6? Why is it such a big deal to be forbidden to be ill-natured and unforgiving? Not just, it's not such a good idea, it's not a nice thing, keeps you up at night, doesn't make you a nice person, it's not going to get you elected to the synagogue board. Instead, Maimonides says it's asur, it's like forbidden, which in the dialect of halakha is not sort of, maybe you don't want to do that. In the dialect of halakha, something that's forbidden is a big deal. So what's going on here? Why is it important to grant forgiveness wholeheartedly and soulfully? Even if the person committed something really terrible against you. So I'm sitting in a room full of Jews. Can I guess somebody's been in therapy besides me? Okay. Look, this is a rhetorical question only because of time. I apologize. I'm sure there's lots of things you guys would want to say. But this is really where I wanted to end, and I want to give you some time to stretch. And I don't know if Rabbi Ryan's up here or downstairs either, so I don't know whether you have. Are we here? We're in this room? Downstairs. So I need to leave you travel time also. So here's what I wanted to leave you with, because this is one of the things that, as I get older, which seems to happen every year, that I really struggle with, but I've also benefited from. It's one of those things that, it's the wisdom that comes with aging, I think, and with age and perspective, that it's really hard to let go of something and forgive someone when the transgression against you was something so wounding, so hurtful, and so deep that your life is always going to be tainted by that interaction. I think what Maimonides was trying to get at here, even if one persecuted another, they shouldn't be vengeful and grudge-bearing, is because the only control you have over the wound that's been done to you at the end of the day when the other person apologizes is your ability to accept the apology and to start to let the space that that hurt takes up in your heart start to heal. Which is why at the end of Nila, I always like to say, so in the language of our tradition, Reconstructionists wouldn't say it exactly this way, but in the language of our tradition, God just gave you this great gift called Yom Kippur. You walk out the door, it's as if everything you did up until now is off the record. But out of sight doesn't mean it's out of mind. Whether you choose to focus on what you did and continue to carry it around, or focus on what you might now do facing forward, that's the choice at the end of Ne'ilah. Right? You want to leave Yom Kippur beating yourself up about what you did last year and the year before and the year before, okay. But that's not what the end of Ne'ilah is about. The end of Ne'ilah is about, you've done that. You can't do anything else about it. The only way is forward from this point. And that's why this tradition and discussion about Shuvah is so important in our tradition. And it's my sense of why we show up on the high holidays, right? Because underneath all of this language and liturgy and Torah reading and shofar and fasting, there is this thing called possibility, potential, and promise. It's what's always in front of you. And I hope, as you spend the rest of the day today, that that opportunity will be something that you see as an invitation and you will choose to accept. Anyway, thank you for your participation and interest this afternoon. Gamar Chatima Tova, and invite you to move downstairs to the social hall. We can join with Rabbi Ryan. Do you want to announce your topic to all these folks as long as they're here?
Just come learn.
Don't tell them, make them come and find
I
out.
promise you it will be worth your time if this is a meaningful way for you to spend your time. I promise. Come on.
Come on down.